The wind in Coldwater, Wyoming came down off the Bighorns with nothing to slow it, and by the third week of August it carried grit fine enough to work into the seams of a person and Oppo's boots and stay there. Nora Vance didn't and Oppo's mind it. She had lived with worse dust in worse places, and this dust at least was hers. She was 47 years old, kneeling in it, replacing a snapped fence staple with the kind of unhurried precision that made a 2-minute job take 10. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. That steadiness had cost her something once a long time ago, and she had spent the better part of 2 decades making sure nobody ever found out what. The ranch was hers outright in name, though not in practice. 240 acres of high scrubland that her father had scraped a living from, that she had inherited along with his debts, and that she had spent 6 years since his death trying to make solvent again. She ran 40 head of cattle and a dozen horses she trained for other people and Oppo's kids, and most months the math came out close enough to breathe. Not this month. Not since the vet bills from Tumbleweed and Oppo's colic surgery had eaten the cushion she and Oppo's built for the note payment, and not since Coldwater AG Credit had sent a second letter, gentler than the first but no less clear, about the balloon payment due in November. She didn't and Oppo's think about the note while she worked. That was a rule she and Oppo's made for herself, the same way she didn't and Oppo's think about Kandahar while she was setting a foal and Oppo's leg, or about the 2 funerals she and Oppo's stood at attention for while she was doing anything at all. Compartmentalization wasn't an Oppo's a coping mechanism to Nora. It was infrastructure. You built the walls before you needed them, not after. The dogs, a pair of aging blue heelers named Scout and Radio, lay in a strip of shade near the truck, occasionally lifting their heads to track a hawk cutting slow circles overhead. It was the kind of morning that made the note payment feel far away, an abstraction easy to set down for an hour of honest work, and Nora had gotten good, over 6 years, at collecting those hours wherever the land offered them. Her father, Walt Vance, had run this land for 41 years on a philosophy that amounted to never owe more than the worst year can cover, and had died owing exactly that much anyway, because a drought and a bad hip and a wife and Oppo's long illness had a way of arriving together no matter how carefully a man planned around them. Nora had come home from her last posting to bury him and had meant, honestly, to sell the place within the year. She had no particular sentiment about ranching, had spent her whole childhood wanting out of it, and had a dozen better paying options a woman with her service record could have walked into. She and Oppo's stayed instead. She still wasn't and Oppo's entirely sure why, except that the quiet of it had matched something in her that needed matching, and that walking the same fence lines her father had walked gave her a kind of ballast she hadn't and Oppo's found anywhere else in the 11 years since her discharge. 6 years in, the ranch was hers in every sense that mattered except the one printed on the loan documents at Coldwater AG Credit, which still carried Walt and Oppo's signature notarized the year Nora turned 19 and which she had spent 6 years slowly, unglamorously working down. She was 11 months from the note being entirely her own, free and clear, when Tanner Voss bought the Hollis place next door and decided the road running past her fence line was an inconvenience beneath his notice. She heard the vehicle before she saw it, an engine too smooth and too expensive for the washboard ruts of County Road 9, and moving faster than the road had any right to allow. She didn't and Oppo's look up right away. She finished driving the staple home with 3 clean hammer strikes, checked the tension of the wire with 2 fingers, and only then straightened and turned toward the dust cloud rolling toward her like weather. A black Range Rover, the kind that had never once needed to be, fishtailed to a stop 20 feet from her truck. The dust it threw settled over her old Chevy and Oppo's hood in a fine gray film. She let it settle. She had learned a long time ago that stillness unsettled people more than any word she could say. The driver and Oppo's door opened and Tanner Voss stepped out into the heat like he was walking onto a stage he and Oppo's built for himself, which in a sense he had. He was 34, 6'2", and put together with the kind of obsessive precision that came from a personal trainer and a nutritionist and nothing better to spend his money on. He and Oppo's made a fortune selling a logistics software company 2 years earlier, cashed out before the market corrected, and moved to Wyoming to become, in his own words to the Coldwater Gazette, and quote, a modern-day frontiersman, end quote. He and Oppo's bought the 1,800 acres bordering Nora and Oppo's land, built a 9,000 square foot house of glass and black steel on the ridge that used to be empty, and converted the old Hollis barn into a combat sports facility with rubber flooring. Shipped from Nevada and a cage in the center of it that had never once needed to hold livestock. He was a second-degree black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, a fact the entire town had learned within a week of his arrival, mostly because he told them. End quote, Vance. End quote, he didn't and Oppos. T say hello. He never did. End quote, your lawyer ghosted mine. That and Oppos. S a hell of a way to negotiate. End quote. End quote. Didn't and Oppos. T ghost anyone. End quote. Nora said, resting her forearm on the top wire of the fence. Her voice was low and even, the kind of voice that had once had to be heard clearly over gunfire and had learned never to need volume to do it. End quote, I read the letter. Answer and Oppos. S the same as it was. End quote. End quote. The access easement cuts through my southeast quarter. End quote. Tanner closed the distance between them fast, the way he closed distance in the cage, eating ground, forcing a reaction. He stopped a foot closer than the conversation called for. End quote, I and Oppos am building a private range out there. I can and Oppos. T have you and your rust bucket rolling through at 5 in the morning every time you feel like it. End quote. End quote, Deed and Oppos. S been recorded since 1961. End quote. Nora said. End quote, 63 years. It and Oppos. S not negotiable. Tanner, it and Oppos. S fact. End quote. End quote, everything and Oppos. S negotiable. End quote. He pulled his sunglasses down half an inch, the way he did when he wanted someone to see his eyes and be moved by them. End quote. I offered $15,000 for the rights. That and Oppos. S real money in a town like this. You could fix that transmission I hear grinding on your truck. You could fix a lot of things. End quote. Nora didn't and Oppos. T answer that. She looked at him the way she and Oppos. D once looked at terrain before deciding how to cross it. Not at his face but at the whole of him, the weight distribution, the tension in his shoulders, the 2-inch heel lift in his boots that told her exactly how much his height mattered to him. It wasn't an Oppos. T conscious. It hadn't an Oppos. T been conscious in a long time. It was just how her mind still worked, quietly underneath the version of herself she showed the world. End quote, I and Oppos. I'll be using that road Friday. End quote, she said. End quote. Same as I have every day for 6 years. Same as my father did for 40 before that. End quote. Something flickered behind Tanner and Oppos. S expression there and gone. It wasn't an Oppos. T anger yet. It was closer to disbelief, the specific disbelief of a man who had never, not once in his adult life, been told no by someone who didn't and Oppos. T work for him. End quote. You have no idea who you and Oppos re-dealing with. End quote, he said. End quote, I and Oppos. We got a fair idea. End quote. Nora said and turned back to her fence line. He stood there a moment too long, the silence doing more damage to him than any retort could have. Then he cursed under his breath, spun on his expensive boots, and stalked back to the Range Rover. He gunned it in reverse hard enough to throw gravel against the side of her truck. She heard 2 dents land. She didn't and Oppos. T turned around to look at them. There was a version of Nora Vance that Coldwater knew, and it was accurate as far as it went. A quiet rancher, polite but not warm, who paid her feed bill on time and kept to herself. What the town didn't and Oppos, T know what almost no one still alive knew, was the 14 years she and Oppos D spent as an Army combatives instructor and military police NCO. 6 of those years split across 2 deployments where her actual job description bore only a loose resemblance to what was written on her orders. She had trained soldiers twice her size to disable men who wanted to kill them, and she had, more times than the Army and Oppos' official record reflected, done the disabling herself. She and Oppos D enlisted at 19 mostly to get out from under a father whose grief over her mother and Oppos' slow decline had curdled in his final years, into a controlled but constant anger that never once landed on Nora directly and somehow felt worse for that restraint. The Army had given her structure, and structure, it turned out, was the thing she and Oppos D been starving for the whole time without knowing its name. She and Oppos D been good at the physical work almost immediately, not naturally gifted so much as unusually willing, the instructors said, to keep going past the point where most recruits quietly negotiated with themselves to stop. Reyes had noticed her in week 3 of combatives training, pulled her aside, and told her flatly that she had the two things that actually mattered and that couldn't and oppose. Be taught. She didn't and oppose. Panic and she didn't and oppose. Enjoy it. Everything else, Reyes said, could be built. Those two had to already be there. 14 years later, when Nora and Oppo's contract came up for its final renewal and she chose, for reasons she never fully explained even to herself, not to sign it, she and Oppo's carried both of those things home with her along with a duffel bag, a folded flag she and Oppo's never had to accept for herself, and a silence that took her the better part of 2 years to learn how to live inside of comfortably. She and Oppo's come home the way a lot of people come home from that kind of work, intact on paper and quietly rearranged underneath it. She and Oppo's buried her instructor, a woman named First Sergeant Odalise Reyes, who had taught her that violence wasn't an Oppo's a talent to be proud of, it was a tool you kept clean and put away, and that the true measure of the skill was how rarely you needed to take it back out. Nora had taken that lesson and built a life around it. 240 acres of quiet was not an accident. It was the thing she had built specifically because she knew with total clarity exactly what she was capable of when the quiet broke. She thought about Reyes sometimes when she worked the fence line alone. She thought about her now, driving into town for feed, replaying the conversation with Tanner and feeling something old shift very slightly under the floorboards of her composure. She remembered specifically a night outside Kandahar when she was 26, sitting on an ammo crate while Reyes cleaned a knife she never used for anything but cleaning, and Reyes had said something Nora hadn't and Oppo's fully understood until years later. The gift I sent and Oppo's the violence Vance. Anybody can learn violence. The gift is knowing exactly how much of it a situation actually requires, and having the discipline to stop there. Reyes had been 38 then, 12 years older than Nora, and had already buried 2 soldiers under her direct command in circumstances she never spoke about except in the specific tightness around her eyes when certain subjects came up. She and Oppo's died 4 years later, not overseas but in a one-car accident on an icy Colorado road 8 months after her discharge. The kind of ending that felt, to everyone who and Oppo's known her, deeply insultingly wrong for a woman who and Oppo's survived so much worse. Nora had driven 11 hours through a snowstorm to stand at that funeral, and had made a promise to herself in the parking lot of the funeral home that she intended to keep for the rest of her life, that whatever Reyes had given her, she would carry the way Reyes had carried it, as a locked door, not a party trick. She had kept that promise for 19 years. She turned it over now, driving toward town, weighing the promise against the shape of what was coming, and did not yet know how she was going to hold both. The Coldwater diner smelled the way it always did: burnt coffee, bacon grease, the particular mustiness of a building that had been heated by the same furnace since 1974. Nora sat in the back booth facing the door the way she always did, and ordered the pot roast the way she always did. Ruth, who and Oppo's waitress there since before Nora was born, brought her coffee without being asked. It was a Tuesday, the quiet kind. Coldwater specialized in outside of tourist season, just a handful of regulars scattered among the booths, 2 ranch hands arguing amiably about a truck engine, an elderly couple splitting a slice of pie in comfortable silence, Ruth moving between tables with the unhurried efficiency of 30 years and Oppo's practice. Nora liked Tuesdays for exactly this reason. It was one of the only places she let herself sit with her back partially to a wall instead of fully to one. A small private concession to a town that had never once given her reason to keep her guard all the way up. The bell over the door rang hard enough to rattle the glass. Tanner Voss walked in trailing 3 of his training partners, men he flew in from Denver and Vegas for sparring sessions and who treated him, in exchange for the pay, like a minor celebrity. They were loud in the specific way of men who had just finished a workout and were still riding the tail end of the adrenaline, laughing too hard, taking up too much of the room and Oppo's air. Ruth stiffened behind the counter. She and Oppo's had trouble with this crowd before, nothing physical, just the particular carelessness of men who assumed the world existed to accommodate them. Tanner and Oppo's eyes found Nora and Oppo's booth immediately, and something in his face sharpened into a grin that had nothing friendly in it. And boys and he said loud enough for the whole diner and come meet my neighbor. Ms. Vance here is a real scholar of 19th century property law, and his friends laughed. One of them, thick through the neck, cracked his knuckles theatrically. They crossed the diner and surrounded her booth the way they and Oppos. D surround an opponent on the mat, instinctively, without thinking about it. Nora kept eating. She cut a piece of pot roast, chewed it, swallowed. She didn't and Oppos. T look up. And quote, I heard you called the sheriff about the gate, and quote, Tanner said, leaning a hand on the edge of her table. And quote, told you it and Oppos. S a civil matter didn't and Oppos he? Told you to lawyer up. Except we both know a lawyer costs more than that truck of yours is worth. And quote. Nora set her fork down. The small click of metal on porcelain was the loudest thing in the room. And quote, you and Oppos. Re in my light and quote, she said. The diner went still. 2 ranch hands at the counter stopped mid-chew. Ruth froze with the coffee pot raised. Tanner and Oppos. S smile dropped away like a mask coming off. The public nature of the disrespect landed somewhere he clearly wasn't and Oppos. T used to being touched. His pride had never had to survive a woman looking through him like he was furniture. And quote, you have no idea the mistake you and Oppos. Remaking and quote. He said, his voice dropping into a register he must have practiced in a mirror. And quote, I and Oppos. Am bringing real money into this dead-end town. I and Oppos. Am bringing attention. And you and Oppos. Re-sitting here in a $2 flannel acting like dirt roads are sacred ground. And quote. Nora looked at him, really looked the flat, appraising look she hadn't and Oppos. T used on another human being in years, and something in her chest went very quiet and very still, the way it used to right before a room went loud. And quote. Money doesn't and Oppos. T by right of way and quote, she said. And quote. And it sure doesn't and Oppos. T by respect. And quote. Tanner reached out, almost lazily, and picked up the salt shaker from her table, tossing it once in the air and catching it, a habit from the cage where he liked to demonstrate he could take anything from an opponent whenever he chose to. And quote, respect is earned, sweetheart. I and Oppos. V competed in Abu Dhabi. I and Oppos. V tapped out grown men twice your size. You want respect, you get on a mat and take it, same as everybody else. And quote. And quote. Put it down and quote, Nora said. And quote, or what? And quote. He dropped the salt shaker into her gravy. Ruth gasped. The thick-necked friend laughed too loud, covering something uneasy underneath it. Nora looked at the ruined plate for a long moment. She didn't an Oppos T sigh. She didn't an Oppos T stand in a hurry. The stillness in her deepened instead, and it was the kind of stillness that made the air in the room feel thinner, though nobody could have said exactly why. She slid out of the booth. She was 5 inches shorter than Tanner and probably 50 pounds lighter, and she stood with her weight settled evenly over both feet, arms loose, the posture of someone who had been taught, once by a woman she and Oppos. D loved like family, exactly how to occupy space without announcing that she knew how. She pulled a tin from her jacket pocket and set it on the counter for Ruth. Then she stepped past Tanner, close enough that her shoulder brushed his chest. Not a shove, just an assertion that the space belonged to her as much as it belonged to him. Tanner and Oppos. S hand closed around her upper arm. And quote, I and Oppos am not finished. And quote. The air in the diner seemed to compress. Nora didn't and Oppos. T pull away and didn't and Oppos T strike. In one motion, so economical it barely registered as movement at all, she rotated her torso, caught his wrist between 2 fingers and the heel of her palm, and applied precise pressure along the nerve line at the base of his thumb. Tanner and Oppos. S fingers sprang open on their own. A short, involuntary gasp left him, his knees dipping a fraction of an inch as his whole hand went numb from wrist to fingertip. He stared at her, uncomprehending, the way a man stares at a math problem that shouldn't and Oppos. T have an answer and does. Nora held his wrist a beat longer than necessary, long enough for him to feel exactly how little effort it had taken, and then let go. And quote. Dawn and Oppos. T touch me again and quote, she said and straightened her collar. The humiliation hit him visibly, a wave of color rising up his neck into his face. His 3 friends were watching. The whole diner was watching. He and Oppos. D been made small by a woman half his size wearing a work shirt in front of an audience he and Oppos. D brought specifically to witness his dominance. And quote, you crazy old and quote. He caught himself, swallowed the word, dropped into a fighting stance instead. Hands up, chin tucked, textbook and useless outside of a gym. End quote. You want to go right here? Let and oppose, go. End quote. End quote. I didn't and oppose. T hit you, end quote, Nora said. End quote. I asked you to take your hand off me. End quote. End quote. You and oppose. Refinished, end quote, Tanner said, stepping forward. The thick-necked friend grabbed his shoulder. End quote. West, chill. Not in here, man. Sheriff pulls your business license if you clock a local in the diner. End quote. Tanner shook him off but stopped advancing, chest heaving, a trembling finger raised at Nora. End quote. You think you and oppose? Something because you know one trick? You think you can embarrass me in front of my own guys? End quote. End quote. You embarrassed yourself, end quote, Nora said quietly. End quote. I just declined to help. End quote. End quote. Founders and oppose day, end quote. Tanner snapped, ignoring her, projecting now for the whole room. End quote. They put up the exhibition ring by the fairgrounds every year for the volunteer fire department fund. You and me. 3 rounds. Unless you only fight when it and oppose. Fair. End quote. Nora turned toward the door. End quote. I don and oppose. T fight for a crowd. End quote. End quote. If you don and oppose. T show, end quote. Tanner called after her, loud enough that every table heard it clearly, end quote. I buy the note on your ranch from Coldwater AG credit before the month and oppose. Out and I call it due the day the papers clear. You and oppose. LLB raising cattle in a parking lot. End quote. Nora stopped with her hand on the door. The threat landed exactly where he and oppose. D aimed it, she and oppose. D known the moment she saw the bank and oppose. Second letter, that there was a version of this where someone with enough money and enough spite could make her problem catastrophically worse before her lawyer could make it better. Coldwater AG Credit was a small regional bank. Small regional banks sold notes to larger ones for a fraction of what they were worth. Especially when someone showed up offering a premium in cash. It would take her attorney months to untangle, if it could be untangled at all, and months were not a resource she had. She thought of Reyes. She thought of the door in her mind that she had spent 20 years keeping welded shut, and the specific, terrible relief of feeling the hinges give. She turned around. End quote. Friday, end quote, she said. End quote. 3 rounds. End quote. Behind the counter, Ruth set the coffee pot down with a hand that wasn't and oppose. Tea quite steady, and for just a moment her eyes met Nora and oppose. Not with alarm but with something closer to recognition. The look of a woman who had watched a lot of men talk too big in that diner over 30 years and had never once seen one of them talk that big at a person who could actually answer for it. She didn't and oppose. T say anything. She didn't and oppose. T need to. Nora pushed through the door into the evening light and didn't and oppose. T looked back. Behind her in the diner, nobody spoke for a long moment. Tanner lowered his hands, trying to reclaim a swagger that had already left the room with her. End quote. I and oppose. Am going to put that woman in the hospital, end quote. He said to his friends low, almost to himself. The thick-necked one, his name was Cody and he and oppose. D known Tanner for 6 years, long enough to have seen him lose exactly 0 times, watched Nora and oppose. Truck pull out of the lot through the front window, and felt something cold settle low in his stomach that he couldn't and oppose. T name and didn't and oppose. T like. Tanner didn't and oppose. T go home that night. He drove up to the Ridge house, poured 2 fingers of scotch he didn't and oppose. Tea taste, and stood at the glass wall of his living room looking down at the dark scattering of lights that was Coldwater, a town he had told himself he was rescuing from irrelevance. He didn't and oppose. Tea examine even privately, why the encounter had rattled him the way it had. If he had, he might have found his way back to a gym in Sacramento when he was 9 years old, a scrawny kid whose father, a man who measured worth exclusively in dominance, who had once told a 12-year-old Tanner that soft men ended up working for hard ones, had enrolled him in jiu-jitsu not to build his confidence but to correct what he saw as a defect. Tanner had spent 25 years since then converting that early humiliation into an armor of accomplishment, black belts and buyouts in glass houses on ridgelines, each one a brick in a wall built to keep a 9-year-old boy from ever being looked at like that again. Nora Vance had looked at him like that in a diner in front of 4 people whose respect he and oppose. D paid for, and something in him that he thought he and oppose. D buried decades ago had come up gasping for air. He told himself it was about the road. He told himself it was about respect, about principle, about a town that needed to understand who was building its future. He believed all of it, mostly the way people believe the story that hurts least. He picked up his phone and texted his lawyer. Find out who holds the note on the Vance Ranch. I want a number by Wednesday. Then he went down to the barn, wrapped his hands, and hit the heavy bag until his knuckles bled through the tape, trying to put the shape of the confrontation into something he could hurt back. Nora and Apo's attorney, a soft-spoken woman named Priya Anand who worked out of a converted feed store 2 towns over, called her Wednesday evening with the news Nora had already braced for. And quote, Coldwater AG Credit confirms they and Apo's V received an offer to purchase your note, end quote, Priya said. End quote. A private buyer above market, 12 cents on the dollar above what the note and Apo's actually worth, which tells you this was never really about the money to him. They Haven and Apo's accepted yet, but the bank and Apo's obligated to consider it, and I won and Apo's lied to you, Nora. A bank that size and offer that clean, they and Apo's I'll probably take it. Small regional lenders like Coldwater AG Credit sell paper like this more often than people realize. It and Apo's not even unusual, it and Apo's just usually not personal. If the note sells and the new holder calls it due, we can fight that under Wyoming and Apo's agricultural lending statutes there and Apo's a whole framework built specifically to slow down exactly this kind of thing, but slowing it down is the operative phrase. It doesn't and Apo's stop it. It buys time while it grinds through a docket. End quote. End quote. How much time, end quote, Nora said. End quote. If he and Apo's aggressive about it, and everything you and Apo's V told me about this man suggests he would be, I and Apo's guess we could hold off a forced sale for 6 to 8 months through injunctive relief alone. Maybe longer if the judge is sympathetic, and rural judges in AG country usually are, for what it and Apo's worth. But 6 to 8 months of legal fees on top of a note payment you and Apo's already stretched to make is not nothing, and it and Apo's not a guarantee. I want you to understand both halves of that before you decide anything. End quote. End quote. How long to fight it properly? End quote. End quote. Realistically? 8 months to get a hearing. Maybe longer if he and Apo's got the money to drag it. And Nora, I have to say this plainly because you and Apo's say it to me if the roles were reversed, even if we win eventually and Apo's doesn't and Apo's feed cattle or make a mortgage payment in November, end quote. Nora sat on her porch step with the phone to her ear, looking out at the dark shape of her barn against a sky gone the color of a fresh bruise. End quote. I understand, end quote, she said. End quote. Whatever this fight thing is that half the town and Apo's already talking about, end quote, Priya said, end quote, I and Apo's am not telling you to do it. I and Apo's am telling you the legal road is real, but it and Apo's slow, and slow is the one thing that man seems to have found a way to buy his way around. End quote. Nora thanked her and hung up. She sat a long time on the step, turning the choice over the way she used to turn over choices in places where the wrong one cost more than money. She thought about Reyes again. Reyes, who used to say that violence was a door you kept locked because once you opened it, you found out things about the room on the other side that you couldn't and Apo's know. She thought about the ranch, about the horses in the barn that depended on her showing up every morning, about her father and Apo's handwriting still visible in pencil on the inside of the tack room door where he and Apo's marked her height every year until she was 17. She was not going to lose this place to a man who and Apo's owned it for 11 months because he could not tolerate being told no. She went inside, found the box in the back of her closet she hadn't and Apo's opened in 6 years, and pulled out a pair of hand wraps that still smelled faintly of chalk and gym rubber. She sat on the edge of her bed, and at the bottom of the same box was a photograph, creased soft at one corner, of herself at 24 standing next to Riz outside a training tent in the flat brown nowhere of eastern Afghanistan, both of them squinting into a sun too bright for the camera to handle. She sat with it a long while. She thought about the promise she and Apo's made in that funeral home parking lot, and she thought too about something else Reyes used to say less often, only when the situation actually called for it. There and Apo's a difference between opening the door because you want to and opening it because the alternative is letting someone else walk through your house unanswered. The second one ISN and Apo's Ta failure of discipline. It and oppose. What the discipline was for. Nora didn't and oppose. Know sitting there which category Friday would turn out to belong to. She suspected she wouldn't and oppose. Know for certain until it was already behind her. She put the photograph back in the box, closed the lid, and spent the 2 days before the fight the way she and oppose. Spent the 2 days before deployments that mattered. Not talking about it, not dramatizing it, just moving her body through the old drills at dawn behind the barn where nobody could see her, getting reacquainted with a version of herself she had genuinely hoped never to need again. Founders and oppos. Day arrived on a Friday that smelled like fried dough, diesel exhaust, and the sweet rot of the cattle pens 2 lots over. The fairgrounds behind the high school had been strung with lights. A Ferris wheel turned lazily against a sky just beginning to purple, and at the far end, past the funnel cake stand and the 4-H barn, they and oppos. Erected the exhibition ring. Raised plywood under a stretched canvas for ropes, halogen work lights on tripods throwing a flat, merciless white glare that drew moths in frantic, dying spirals. Word had gotten out fast, the way it does in a town of 1,100 people. It was no longer billed, in the whispers passed across fence lines and grocery store aisles, as a charity exhibition. It was billed as a spectacle, the rich outsider who and oppos. Bought half the valley, finally putting the quiet rancher who and oppos. Embarrassed him in her place. Half the town showed up. Pickup beds filled with lawn chairs. Coolers of beer changed hands. Nobody quite admitted, even to themselves, what they were hoping to see. Tanner arrived like he was walking into an arena, a silk robe with his gym and oppos' logo stitched in gold thread across the back, 3 cornermen trailing him with towels and water bottles and a jar of petroleum jelly nobody had asked for. He vaulted the ropes, bounced twice on the canvas, and threw a combination into the humid air that drew a scattering of uneasy applause. Someone had set up a card table near the beer tent where 2 teenagers were quietly running odds, chalking numbers on a piece of poster board, and erasing them as the betting shifted. Nearly everyone had Tanner favored 2-1. A few of the older ranch hands, men who and oppos. Watched Nora grow up and had a vague, half-remembered sense that she and oppos, and quote, been somewhere and quote, during her years away, put a few dollars on her anyway, more out of local loyalty than conviction. Somewhere in the crowd, a toddler cried and was hushed. Somewhere else, a portable radio played a country station too quiet to make out the words, and the DJ and oppos' voice cut in between songs to remind everyone that funnel cakes were $2 off until 9. It was, in other words, still a county fair, right up until it wasn't and oppos' Nora parked her truck out on the county highway, a quarter-mile off, and walked in alone. She wore jeans and a plain gray t-shirt and carried nothing but the hand wraps rolled into a ball in her fist. No entourage. No music. The crowd, when they saw her walking toward the lights, went quieter than they had for Tanner. Not with excitement, but with something closer to unease, the specific discomfort of watching someone they thought they knew reveal an edge they and oppos' never seen. Sheriff Dale Pruitt, a heavy-set man with 22 years on the job and a mustache gone entirely gray, met her at the base of the ring steps, his face troubled. And quote, Nora, you don and oppos' have to do this and quote, he said low. And quote, I can shut this whole thing down right now, safety hazard insurance, whatever I need to call it. We can fight the note through the courts. I and oppos' I'll write a statement myself if it helps. End quote. End quote, court and oppos' 8 months, Dale, end quote, Nora said. End quote. This is 3 rounds. End quote. She climbed the steps. She didn't and oppos' take off her boots. Tanner, seeing this, laughed out loud from across the ring. End quote. You and oppos' re-fighting in work boots? I and oppos' am going to break your ankle in the first 30 seconds. End quote. Nora didn't and oppos' answer. She went to her corner. There was no stool for her, she hadn't and oppos' asked for one, and began wrapping her hands over the tape that was already there, slow figure-8 loops around the knuckles, the motion so deeply worn into her muscle memory that her eyes never left Tanner while she did it. The noise of the crowd, the halogen glare, the moths, none of it reached her. She was descending deliberately into a quiet, dark room in her own mind that she had kept locked for 20 years, and she felt the door give way beneath her hand with a kind of grief she hadn't and oppos' expected. Pruitt called them to the center. Tanner strode forward, chest out, refusing to touch gloves, searching her face for a flicker of fear. He found nothing. Just a stillness with no bottom to it. End quote. Standard rules, end quote. Pruitt shouted over the crowd. End quote. No strikes to the back of the head, no eye contact strikes, no groin shots. You protect yourself at all times. You listen to my stoppage. Understood. End quote. End quote. Understood, end quote, Tanner said. Nora gave a single, barely perceptible nod. Pruitt stepped back, raised his hand. The crowd fell silent enough that the hum of the generator and the tick of moths against the halogen bulbs were the loudest sounds in the lot. End quote. Fight. End quote. Tanner moved first fast, the explosive fast twitch speed of a man who spent 3 hours a day sculpting his body for exactly this kind of moment. He closed distance with a sliding step, feinted a jab toward her face to draw her guard up, and dropped his hips to fire a heavy leg kick at the meat of her thigh. A clean textbook Muay Thai strike meant to deaden the leg and cut her base out from under her in one motion. Nora didn't end oppose. T retreat and didn't end oppose. T checked the kick with her shin. She did something that broke every instinct trained into a sport fighter. She stepped inside the arc of the strike entirely, closing the distance before his hip could finish rotating. So his shin only slapped harmlessly against her own hip instead of connecting where he and oppose. D aimed. And she wasn't an oppose, T just defending. As her boots planted, her right hand shot forward. Not a fist, an open palm, driven with her whole body weight behind it into the center of Tanner and oppose's sternum. The impact cracked flat and hard over the drone of the generators. The air left his lungs in a ragged, involuntary wheeze. His mouth guard nearly jarred loose. His forward momentum hitting a wall and reversing so fast his balance staggered. Nora didn't an oppose, T reset. She flowed forward, closing the gap he had in oppose. T recovered, and when he threw a desperate, wide overhand right in a panic, she wasn't an oppose. T where it landed. She dropped her level 3 inches, slipped beneath his arm, stepped deep behind his lead leg, hooked her arm under his and pivoted her hips with a torque that had nothing sport about it. It was a technique built for mud and darkness and men who didn't and oppose. T-tap. Tanner and oppose's feet left the canvas. For one suspended half-second he hung in the harsh white light, moths scattering around the bulb above him, before gravity and Nora and oppose's driving weight brought him down flat on his back. The plywood shuddered. Chalk dust plumed into the air. 300 people sucked in a breath at once and the sound of it disappeared into the night. Before the shock finished rattling through him, Nora was already down, past him, settling into side control with her knee driven into the soft tissue below his ribs. He screamed, a high, thin sound that carried out past the bleachers toward the dark highway, and thrashed, trying to bridge, trying to shrimp free, trying to bring every technique 2 decades of training had given him to bear. None of it worked. Moving against her felt like trying to shift a fence post set in concrete. Her balance had no seam to exploit. Every time he adjusted, she was already a quarter inch ahead of him, and the knee in his ribs ground deeper. He looked up at her face, waiting for the flush of triumph he and oppose have worn in her place. He found instead a terrible total stillness, her breathing slow, her eyes fixed on his throat not as a person and oppose's throat but as a mechanism that needed shutting off. Real fear finally broke through his adrenaline, cold and absolute, the understanding landing on him all at once that he had not climbed into a ring with a rancher. He had climbed into a ring with something else entirely, something that had been asleep a long time and had just woken up. Somewhere very far beneath the surface of her concentration, in the part of Nora and oppose's mind that never fully stopped narrating even in the middle of a thing like this, she registered Reyes and oppose's voice clear as if she were standing at ringside. You and oppose, I'll know it and oppose's discipline and not appetite by whether you can still hear me when it matters. She could hear her. That was the whole of the answer. And it steadied her hands even as the rest of her moved on a track that had nothing to do with steadiness at all. Old grooves, old training. The parts of her that had never needed her permission to know exactly what came next. Nora slid her forearm across his throat, angled to compress the carotid rather than crush the windpipe. Controlled, precise, deliberate. Tanner clawed at her wrist with both taped hands, tearing skin, and it did nothing at all, the way pulling at a fence post does nothing. The edges of his vision blurred gray. The crowd noise dissolved into the sound of rushing water. End quote. You wanted my road, end quote. Nora said, quiet, almost gentle. the words entirely at odds with what her body was doing. And quote, "You wanted my note. You wanted me small enough to fit into whatever story you tell yourself about who deserves this valley." End quote. Tanner and Apos. S mouth opened around a sound that wasn't Apos. T language anymore. End quote. "Money doesn't and Apos. T make you dangerous," end quote, she said. End quote. "A belt doesn't and Apos. T make you dangerous. I know what dangerous actually looks like, and it isn and Apos. T you." End quote. His hands stopped clawing. They began tapping instead. Frantic, desperate, against her shoulder. Surrender, total and absolute. She held the choke 1 second longer than she needed to. In that second she felt the old door in her mind swing all the way open, felt the thing on the other side of it rise up eager and awake after 20 years asleep, and understood with total clarity how much easier it would be to keep going than to stop. It took more of her than the entire fight had taken to make her arm relax. She released him, rose in one clean motion, and stepped back 3 full paces. Tanner rolled onto his side, coughing violently, sucking air in ragged whoops, curling around his bruised ribs. Chalk dust streaked through the tears running down his face. Shock, pain, and something far more total than either. The fairgrounds were silent. Nobody cheered. Nobody booed. 300 people stood frozen by the speed and totality of what they and Apos D just watched. The clock on the scorer and Apos S table read 31 seconds. Sheriff Pruitt stood against the ropes, his mouth slightly open, looking between the sobbing man on the canvas and the woman standing utterly still at the center of the ring, and for a moment he didn't and Apos T move at all. Nora looked down at her own taped hands. They were trembling, a fine involuntary tremor of adrenaline working its way out of her. She hated that tremor. She had always hated it because of what it meant. That the door didn't and Apos T stay closed just because you wanted it to. It stayed closed because you made it every single time on purpose. She walked to her corner, tore the tape from her left wrist, then her right, and dropped the wadded ball over the ropes into the dirt near the sneakers of Tanner and Apos S cornermen. End quote. "Call it," end quote, she said to Pruitt. He blinked, shook himself loose, and knelt beside Tanner, who weakly waved him off, still unable to speak through the coughing. Pruitt stood, walked to the center of the ring, raised his hand. End quote. "Match is over," end quote, he said, his voice cracking through the PA. End quote. "Winner, Nora Vance." End quote. No applause followed. Only a low, uneasy murmur rolling through the crowd like weather changing. Nora ducked through the ropes and descended the wooden steps, her boots landing heavy and final on each one. The crowd parted for her, wider than it had before, and this time nobody met her eyes. Cody, the thick-necked friend, stood blocking the exit path near the concession stand, his face flushed with a mixture of loyalty and embarrassment that had nowhere to go. He balled his fists, though his stance was already retreating before his hands had finished forming. End quote. "You got lucky," end quote, he said without conviction. Nora stopped and turned her head, and the flat stillness that had lived in her eyes throughout the fight hadn't and Apos T fully receded yet. End quote. "Don and Apos T make me do this twice," end quote, she said quiet. Cody and Apos S color drained. He looked into her eyes a moment longer, saw whatever was actually there, and stepped aside without another word. She walked out past the Ferris wheel, past the murmuring crowd, out into the dark beyond the halogen glare, and didn't and Apos T look back. At her truck, she rested her forehead against the cool metal of the door for a long minute, eyes closed, letting the night air pull the sweat from her neck. The tremor in her hands slowly quieted. Somewhere behind her sternum, a door she had spent 20 years holding shut creaked closed again, the lock sliding home, and she found she was crying quietly from something that wasn't and Apos T grief and wasn't and Apos T relief, but sat somewhere close to both. She drove home in the dark with the windows down. Tanner didn't and Apos T go back to the Rich House that night. He sat instead in his Range Rover in the empty fairgrounds lot for the better part of an hour, the engine off, his ribs aching with every breath, replaying the 31 seconds on a loop. He couldn't and Apos T make stop. It wasn't an Apos T the pain that undid him. He and Apos D taken worse in competition and walked it off within the week. It was the specific quality of what he and Apos D seen in her face while her forearm was across his throat, that flat, total absence of anything he could bargain with, anything he could perform for, anything that responded at all to who he was or what he owned. He had spent his entire adult life building a version of himself specifically designed to never again feel the particular smallness his father had specialized in making him feel, and a rancher in work boots had produced that exact feeling in 31 seconds without raising her voice once. He thought about calling his father, the way he sometimes still did after a win, needing the validation even now, even at 34, even knowing exactly how little it would ever actually satisfy him. He didn't an Oppo's tea call. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he understood, sitting alone in the dark, that there wasn't an Oppo's tea going to be a version of this story he could tell that made him the person he needed the room to believe he was. He called his broker instead at 11 at night and told him to list the Ridge property first thing Monday. He called his facilities manager and told him to cancel the range permits. Then he sat in the dark a while longer, not doing anything at all, which was, for Tanner Voss, its own kind of unfamiliar country. By Saturday morning he was gone. His crew and their gear loaded into 2 trucks headed for the interstate before most of Coldwater was awake. He did not say goodbye to anyone. He did not attempt to renegotiate the note. Whatever had cracked open in him at the center of that ring, he took it with him, and Coldwater, for its part, was content to let him go. The days after Founders and Oppo's Day were strange in a way Nora hadn't and Oppo's T anticipated. She and Oppo's D expected shame or gossip, or the particular small-town chill that follows anyone who becomes, however briefly, the subject everyone is discussing. What she got instead was quieter and harder to name. Ruth from the diner sent over a jar of her mother and Oppo's chokecherry jam with no note attached, which in Ruth and Oppo's language meant more than any note could have. The Hendersons, who ran the feed store, started saving her the good bales without being asked. A woman Nora barely knew, whose daughter boarded a horse with her, stopped her in the grocery store parking lot and said only, and quote, "My ex used to talk to me the way that man talked to you in that diner. I heard what you did," end quote, and then walked away before Nora could figure out how to respond. She hadn't and Oppo's done any of it for the town. She understood that. But she also understood slowly over the following week that something in Coldwater and Oppo's relationship to her had shifted, not toward fear, though there was some of that, but toward a kind of unspoken recognition. They had thought they knew a quiet woman who kept to herself. They had learned instead that the quiet had never been emptiness. It had been discipline. Cody came by the ranch on Thursday, unannounced, standing awkwardly at the end of her drive with his truck idling like he hadn't and Oppo's fully committed to staying. Nora walked out to meet him, not unfriendly, not warm either, just present. End quote, wanted to say something, end quote, he said, looking mostly at his boots. End quote, about the diner. About after. I and Oppo's known West a long time. Knew him before all the money actually, we grew up 2 streets apart in Sacramento. He wasn't and Oppo's always like that, end quote, he shrugged a little helplessly. End quote. Guess that doesn't and Oppo's excuse it. Just wanted you to know not everybody standing around him thought what happened to you was funny. I didn't and Oppo's say anything at the time, and I should have. End quote. Nora considered him for a moment. End quote. You stepped in before it went further than a salt shaker, end quote, she said. End quote, that and Oppo's not nothing. End quote. He nodded, seemed to want to say more, didn't and Oppo's and drove off. She didn't and Oppo's know what to make of the visit exactly, except that it seemed like the kind of small, unglamorous repair a place makes to itself after something breaks in public. Not dramatic, not resolved, just an attempt, and she found she respected the attempt more than she and Oppo's have expected to. Priya called on Tuesday with an update tinged with something close to wonder in her voice. End quote, the bank and Oppo's buyer withdrew the offer Sunday night, end quote, she said. End quote. No explanation given. Coldwater AG credit and Oppo's holding your note same as always, and I got a call from the bank president himself saying they and Oppo's not entertaining any more third-party offers on it, period. Whatever happened out at that fairground, Nora, it worked. End quote. End quote, I didn't and Oppo's do it for that, end quote. Nora said, which was true and also not the whole truth, and she let both things sit in her without needing to resolve them. Monday morning, the sun came up over cold water the color of hammered copper, same as it always did, and Nora was out at the fence line by 6, dew still heavy on the sage, gloves on, driving a new line of wire tight against a cedar post her father had set 30 years before. Her knees ached from the pivot. Her shoulders were stiff in a way they hadn't been in years. The world mostly was exactly as it had been. A county survey truck rolled down the road and pulled onto the shoulder. A man in a reflective vest climbed out with a clipboard. And quote, "Morning, Ms. Vance." And quote, "Morning, Hal." And quote, "Wanted you to hear it from me before it and Oppos. All over town, which it will be by lunch." And quote, Hal adjusted his hard hat against the rising sun. And quote, Voss pulled every permit he had filed Friday night. The range, the gate, all of it. Word is he and Oppos. Listing the whole property. Left for California Saturday morning with his crew. House up on the ridge and Oppos. Sitting empty. End quote. Nora twisted a wire tie shut, clamped it with her pliers and didn't end Oppos. Look up right away. End quote. Is that so? End quote. Yep. End quote. Hal shook his head, half amused, half something else. End quote. Man drops 11 million on this valley and lasts 11 months. Guess some places aren't and Oppos. For sale even when the price is right. End quote. Nora set her pliers back in her tool pouch and looked down the road. It was empty. No dust cloud, no engine whine. Nothing but the wind moving through dry August grass the way it had moved through it every August of her life. End quote. Fence makes a good neighbor. End quote, she said, mostly to herself. Hal tipped his hard hat. End quote. You have a good one, Nora. End quote. You too, Hal. End quote. She watched the survey truck turn around and pull away, and something in her shoulders, a tightness she hadn't and Oppos, fully let herself notice she was carrying, finally let go all at once the way a held breath does when the danger and Oppos actually passed and not just paused. She looked out over her 240 acres of dry, unforgiving, entirely hers land. It wasn't and Oppos much. It had never needed to be much. It only needed to be quiet, and it had cost her something to keep it that way. Not money, not in the end, but a door she and Oppos have preferred to leave shut for the rest of her life, opened once more and then deliberately, carefully closed again. She picked her pliers back up and went back to work, because the fence wasn't and Oppos going to finish itself. Around 9, a familiar dust-colored Subaru pulled up the drive. Marisol Ibarra, 12 years old, come for her Monday lesson on the paint gelding Nora had been training for her since spring. Marisol climbed out with her helmet already on crooked, the way it always was until Nora fixed it for her, and stood at the gate a moment longer than usual, working up to something. End quote. My mom said what you did. End quote. Marisol said finally, not quite meeting Nora and Oppos' eyes. End quote. At the fair. She said you used to be in the army and that and Oppos' how you knew what to do. End quote. That and Oppos' about the size of it. End quote. Nora said, straightening the girl and Oppos' helmet strap without being asked. End quote. Were you scared? End quote. Nora considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things Marisol asked her, because the girl had a habit of asking the ones adults usually dodged. End quote. Some. End quote, she said. End quote. Not of him. Of what it would cost me to do what needed doing. Those aren't and Oppos' always the same kind of scared. End quote. Marisol turned that over with the particular solemnity of a 12-year-old deciding whether an answer was good enough to keep. Apparently it was, because she nodded once and asked instead whether Domino remembered his leads from last week, and the lesson went on the way lessons always did, ordinary and unremarkable, the gelding and Oppos' hooves raising small clouds of dust in the round pen while the morning climbed higher and hotter over the valley. That, Nora thought, watching the girl post a slow trot with her tongue between her teeth in concentration, was the whole of what she and Oppos' fought to keep. Not the acreage. Not even the note, paid down another month closer to hers alone. Just this, a Monday morning, a kid learning to sit a trot. A life quiet enough that a person could hear herself think in it, undisturbed by anyone who believed that quiet was the same thing as weak. By the time Marisol and Oppos' mother came to collect her at noon, the heat had settled fully into the valley, shimmering faintly off the tin roof of the barn, And Nora stood at the gate a while after they and Oppos. D gone, looking out at the land the way she had looked at it nearly every day for 6 years. Appraising it, tending it, belonging to it in the specific and unglamorous way that only comes from having nearly lost a thing and gotten to keep it anyway. Some fights aren't in Oppos. T about who wins. They and Oppos. Re about what you and Oppos. Re willing to become again for one night to protect what peace you and Oppos. V already paid for.